Knighthood is nothing like what you think it is. Shining armor, honorable battles, beautiful princesses. The truth is, being a medieval knight was one of the worst jobs in history. Tonight you'll learn the realities Hollywood never shows you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year was 1347, and 7-year-old William stood crying in the courtyard of Lord Edmund's castle. His father, a minor nobleman, had just handed him over to begin his journey toward knighthood. The boy's tears meant nothing here. This wasn't a school or a summer camp. This was the beginning of a brutal system that would break him down and rebuild him into something barely human. William didn't know it yet, but he had just entered one of history's most punishing institutions. The path to becoming a knight wasn't noble or romantic. It was a decades-long nightmare of violence, humiliation, and psychological destruction. And he was one of the lucky ones. He had noble blood. Most boys who dreamed of knighthood never even got the chance to suffer through it. The medieval world didn't believe in childhood as we know it. There were no toys, no playtime, no gentle guidance into adulthood. Children were seen as small, defective adults who needed to be hammered into proper shape through pain and discipline. For future knights, this philosophy was taken to its most extreme conclusion. William's first role was as a page, the lowest rung on the knightly ladder. His day began before dawn in the stone-cold castle. There was no central heating, no warm breakfast, no gentle wake-up call. A gruff servant would shake him awake in the dark, and he would stumble out of his straw bed to begin another day of misery. His first task was always the same: empty the chamber pots. Yes, the future defender of Christendom started each day carrying buckets of human waste down narrow, slippery castle stairs. The smell was overwhelming, the work degrading, and the punishment for spilling even a drop was swift and brutal. A wooden paddle across the back, a fist to the head, or hours locked in a dark cellar with the rats. After the waste removal came the endless list of menial labor. William scrubbed floors on his hands and knees until his fingers bled. He hauled water from the well in heavy buckets that left permanent marks on his small shoulders. He cleaned fireplaces, choking on ash and soot that would leave him coughing for hours. He polished armor and weapons that weighed more than he did, struggling to lift pieces that would one day be strapped to his own body. The castle's knights took pleasure in tormenting the pages. They would deliberately spill wine on freshly cleaned floors and watch the boys scramble to clean it up again. They would knock food from their hands and make them eat scraps off the ground like dogs. They would send pages on impossible errands: fetch water from a dry well, find a left-handed sword, bring back a bucket of steam from the kitchen. These weren't harmless pranks. They were deliberate psychological warfare, designed to break down any sense of self-worth or dignity. The message was clear: you are nothing. You own nothing. You are worth nothing. Everything you have, everything you are, exists at the pleasure of your betters, and your betters could be anyone with more rank, more money, or simply a bigger fist. Education existed, but it was brutal and narrow. William learned to read and write, but only enough to understand military orders and religious text. Mathematics meant calculating supplies for a siege or dividing loot after a battle. History lessons focused on famous military victories and the proper way to show deference to superiors. There was no literature, no philosophy, no art, nothing that might encourage independent thinking or creativity. The religious training was perhaps the most twisted part of his education. William was taught that God had personally chosen him for this life of service and suffering. Every humiliation, every beating, every degrading task was presented as divine will. Questioning the system wasn't just disobedience, it was heresy. The church and the nobility worked hand in hand to convince these boys that their misery was not only deserved but holy. Physical training began almost immediately, and it was designed to be as painful as possible. 7-year-old William was handed a wooden sword that was deliberately too heavy for him to lift properly. He was forced to practice swings until his arms felt like they would fall off. When he dropped the weapon from exhaustion, he was beaten for weakness. When he cried from the pain, he was beaten for showing emotion. When he tried to rest, he was beaten for laziness. The other pages offered no friendship or support. They had learned quickly that showing kindness to another boy was seen as weakness, and weakness was punished severely. Instead, they competed viciously for the smallest scraps of approval from their tormentors. They would sabotage each other's work, steal each other's meager possessions, and report each other's failures to the knights. Trust was a luxury that could get you killed. Sleep was a rare commodity. Pages were expected to be available at all hours of the day and night. If a knight wanted wine at midnight, a page had to fetch it. If armor needed cleaning at dawn, a page had to do it. The beds were thin straw mattresses infested with fleas and lice. The rooms were shared with a dozen other boys, so privacy was impossible. Many pages learned to sleep while standing up, grabbing moments of rest while performing their duties. Food was scarce and terrible. Pages ate the scraps left over after the knights and castle staff had finished their meals. This usually meant stale bread, watery soup, and occasionally a piece of meat so tough it was barely edible. Many boys were constantly hungry, and stealing food was both common and severely punished. Getting caught with an extra crust of bread could mean a day in the stocks or a brutal beating. The psychological toll was enormous. Many pages didn't survive their first year. Some died from disease or injury, but others simply gave up. They would stop eating, stop speaking, stop responding to orders. The castle staff would find them huddled in corners staring at nothing, their minds shattered by the constant abuse and humiliation. These boys were quietly removed and forgotten, their names never mentioned again. But William endured. Not because he was stronger or braver than the others, but because he learned to shut down emotionally. He stopped crying, stopped hoping, stopped feeling. He became a hollow shell that could perform tasks and absorb punishment without reaction. This wasn't resilience, it was psychological damage that would follow him for the rest of his life. After years of this treatment, pages who survived were promoted to squire. This was supposed to be an honor, a step up the ladder toward knighthood. In reality, it was just a different kind of hell. As a squire, William would be assigned to a specific knight as a personal servant. His master owned him completely, and the relationship was often indistinguishable from slavery. The squire's job was to keep his knight's equipment in perfect condition, help him dress for battle, and follow him into combat as a support warrior. This meant carrying heavy equipment for miles, sleeping on the ground in all weather, and watching his master kill and be killed in the most brutal ways imaginable. Many squires died in their first battle, not from enemy action, but from sheer terror and inexperience. The transition from page to squire usually happened around age 14. But some boys were held back for years if they showed insufficient subservience. Others were promoted early if they demonstrated a particular talent for violence or cruelty. The system was arbitrary and cruel, designed to keep everyone off balance and desperate for approval. By the time William became a squire, he had already lost most of what we would recognize as normal human emotion. He felt no joy, No sadness, no fear. Only a constant, grinding awareness of his place in the hierarchy, and the need to avoid punishment. He had been transformed from a crying 7-year-old into something closer to a trained animal, and this was considered success. The training intensified as a squire. William learned to fight with real weapons now, but the instruction was still brutal and unforgiving. He was beaten unconscious more times than he could count, suffered countless broken bones and deep cuts, and was forced to continue training even when seriously injured. Pain was not an excuse, it was just another obstacle to overcome. He also learned the darker skills that knights needed. How to extract information from prisoners through torture. How to execute captured enemies efficiently. How to burn crops and destroy villages to starve civilian populations. How to rape and pillage conquered territories. These weren't side effects of warfare. They were deliberate military tactics, and every knight needed to master them. The years blurred together in a haze of violence, servitude, and gradual dehumanization. William watched other squires die in training accidents, combat, or simply from the accumulated damage of years of abuse. He saw strong boys become broken men, brave boys become cowards, and kind boys become monsters. The system worked exactly as intended. As William approached his 20th birthday, he began to prepare for his final test, the ceremony that would make him a knight. He had survived over a decade of systematic brutalization. He had learned to kill without hesitation, to follow orders without question, and to inflict suffering without remorse. He was no longer the crying 7-year-old who had been dragged from his family. He was something else entirely, a weapon in human form, pointed at the world by men who cared nothing for his life or soul. But becoming a knight wouldn't end his suffering. It would only change its nature. William's knighting ceremony had finally arrived. After 13 years of abuse, degradation, and systematic dehumanization, he was about to become Sir William. But first came the armor, and with it, a whole new category of suffering that would define the rest of his miserable existence. The process of getting dressed as a knight was not the romantic ritual depicted in movies. It was a grueling, hour-long ordeal that required multiple assistants and often left the knight exhausted before he even began his duties. William stood naked in the cold stone chamber as his squire began the complex process of encasing him in metal. First came the padded undergarment, called an akatan or gambeson. This was supposed to provide cushioning between his skin and the metal, but it was made of rough wool and linen that chafed and irritated with every movement. The padding was often dirty and infested with lice, fleas, and other parasites that would make his life a constant nightmare of itching and infection. Many knights developed permanent rashes and sores from wearing this filthy underlayer against their skin for hours at a time. Next came the mail hauberk, a shirt made of thousands of interlocking metal rings. This single piece weighed nearly 20 pounds and hung heavily on William's shoulders. The metal rings pinched his skin, caught his body hair, and created pressure points that would leave permanent marks on his shoulders and back. The mail offered some protection against cuts, but it was useless against blunt force trauma. A mace or war hammer could crush bones right through the mail without breaking a single ring. Over the mail went the plate armor, piece by piece. The breastplate alone weighed 15 pounds and was designed to deflect sword blows and arrows, but it also severely restricted breathing and movement. William found that he could no longer bend at the waist, turn his head freely, or raise his arms above shoulder height. Simple tasks like picking something up from the ground became major undertakings requiring careful planning and assistance. The arm protection consisted of multiple pieces, braces for the upper arms, couters for the elbows, and vambraces for the forearms. Each piece was held in place by leather straps and metal pins that dug into his flesh. The joints were designed to allow movement, but they also created gaps where enemy weapons could penetrate. Many knights lost fingers, hands, or entire arms to sword thrusts that found these vulnerable spots. The leg armor was equally cumbersome. Cuisses protected the thighs, paulins covered the knees, and greaves guarded the shins. The sabatons, or armored shoes, were so heavy and inflexible that walking became an awkward, shuffling gait. Running was nearly impossible, and mounting a horse required a specially designed mounting block or assistance from multiple people. The helmet was perhaps the worst part of the entire ensemble. William's great helm completely enclosed his head, with only narrow slits for vision and breathing. Inside the helmet, the temperature quickly became unbearable. His breath condensed on the metal, creating a steamy, claustrophobic environment that fogged his vision and made breathing difficult. The weight of the helmet put enormous strain on his neck, and many knights developed permanent spinal problems from years of wearing these metal torture devices. The complete suit of armor weighed between 60 and 80 pounds. This might not sound like much, but try carrying that weight for 12 hours while fighting for your life. The armor distributed the weight unevenly across the body, creating pressure points that would leave William bruised and aching after every use. The metal conducted heat and cold mercilessly, making him freeze in winter and roast in summer. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the hygiene nightmare. Once armored, William could not remove any piece of his equipment without assistance. This meant that bathroom functions became a major logistical challenge. Some knights wore leather undergarments designed to catch waste, but these were expensive and often leaked. Most simply relieved themselves in their armor and endured the stench and irritation until they could be helped out of their metal prison. Urination was difficult enough, but defecation was a nightmare. Knights would often go days without proper bowel movements, leading to severe constipation and abdominal pain. When nature finally called during battle or a long march, they had no choice but to soil themselves and continue fighting. The smell was overwhelming, both for the knight and for anyone unfortunate enough to be near him. Enemy soldiers could often smell a group of knights approaching from hundreds of yards away. The armor also created a perfect breeding ground for disease and infection. The dark, warm, moist environment inside a suit of armor was ideal for bacteria and fungi. Knights regularly developed skin infections, boils, and festering sores that could become life-threatening if left untreated. The constant chafing from the rough padding created open wounds that became infected with alarming frequency. Cleaning the armor was another full-time nightmare. Blood, mud, and other substances would get into every crevice and joint. The metal had to be carefully cleaned and oiled after every use to prevent rust, but this was nearly impossible to do thoroughly. Most knights' armor was in a constant state of partial corrosion, with rust stains and pitted surfaces that provided handholds for enemy weapons. The cost of maintaining a full suit of armor was astronomical. A single suit could cost as much as a small farm, and that was just the initial purchase. Repairs were constant and expensive. A dented breastplate had to be hammered back into shape by a skilled armorer. Broken rings in the mail had to be individually replaced. Leather straps and padding wore out regularly and needed replacement. Many knights went into crushing debt trying to maintain their equipment. They would mortgage their lands, borrow money at ruinous interest rates, and sometimes resort to highway robbery just to pay for armor repairs. The economic pressure was so intense that some knights deliberately sought out wealthy enemies to capture for ransom, purely to fund their equipment costs. The armor also made knights incredibly vulnerable in certain situations. If a knight fell into water while fully armored, he would sink like a stone and drown almost instantly. Many knights died not from enemy action but from falling into rivers, moats, or marshes while wearing their metal burial shrouds. Rescue was nearly impossible because the armor was too heavy for bystanders to lift. Heat exhaustion was another constant threat. During summer campaigns, knights would collapse from overheating while wearing their metal ovens. The armor trapped body heat so effectively that internal temperatures could reach dangerous levels within minutes of physical exertion. Many knights died from heat stroke during seemingly routine activities like marching or training. The psychological effects of wearing armor were often overlooked, but equally devastating. The complete sensory deprivation inside a helmet created a feeling of isolation and claustrophobia that drove some knights to panic attacks. The restricted vision and hearing made them feel vulnerable and paranoid. The weight and restriction of movement created a constant sense of being trapped. Combat in full armor was nothing like the graceful sword fights shown in movies. Knights moved slowly and clumsily, swinging their weapons in wide, exhausting arcs. Battles became wars of attrition, where victory went to whoever could stay upright longest. Most combat was decided not by skill or courage but by endurance and brute strength. The armor's effectiveness was also greatly exaggerated. While it could deflect some sword cuts and arrow hits, it was far from invulnerable. Crossbow bolts could punch through most armor at close range. Maces and warhammers could crush bones right through the metal, and any weapon that got through the joints could cause devastating injuries. Perhaps most importantly, the armor did nothing to protect against the most common causes of death in medieval warfare: disease, infection, and exhaustion. Knights in armor were actually more likely to die from its wounds than unarmored soldiers because their equipment made proper wound care nearly impossible. The weight of the armor also made horses essential for any knight who wanted to remain mobile. But war horses were even more expensive than armor and required constant care, feeding, and training. A knight's total equipment package, including horse, armor, weapons, and support staff, could cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. William learned all of this the hard way. During his first campaign, within hours of putting on his armor, he was covered in sweat, struggling to breathe, and fighting waves of nausea from the heat and restriction. By the end of the first day, he had open sores on his shoulders and hips from the armor's weight and chafing. By the end of the first week, he was seriously considering abandoning his knightly vows and running away. But there was no escape. The armor was both his protection and his prison. A metal shell that marked him as a member of the warrior elite, while slowly destroying his body and mind. Every day he wore it was a day of suffering, but removing it meant abandoning everything he had worked toward for 13 years. The romantic image of the shining knight was just that, an image. The reality was a man trapped inside a metal torture device, struggling to breathe, move, and fight, while carrying crushing debt and social obligations. The armor that was supposed to make him invincible instead made him a slow-moving target, a walking advertisement for the wealth and status he could never truly afford. And this was just the beginning of his knightly misery. William's first real battle came 3 months after his knighting ceremony, and nothing could have prepared him for the horror that awaited him on the blood-soaked fields of medieval warfare. Hollywood had filled the world's imagination with images of noble combat, honorable duels, and glorious victories. The reality was a nightmarish carnival of blood, screaming, and senseless brutality that would haunt William's dreams for the rest of his life. The morning of the battle began before dawn with the sound of horns echoing across the camp. William had barely slept, his stomach churning with a mixture of terror and anticipation. The other knights around him tried to project confidence, but he could see the fear in their eyes, the way their hands shook as they checked their weapons for the 100th time. Many of them were vomiting from nervousness, adding to the already overwhelming stench of the military camp. The preparation for battle was a chaotic affair that bore no resemblance to the organized military formations depicted in movies. Knights stumbled around in the pre-dawn darkness, searching for their equipment, their horses, their squires. Weapons were lost, armor pieces went missing, and more than one knight discovered critical damage to his gear that hadn't been noticed the night before. The air was filled with curses, shouted orders, and the general panic of men who knew they might die before the sun set. William's destrier, the massive warhorse that was supposed to be his advantage on the battlefield, was already showing signs of distress. The animal could sense the tension and fear of the humans around it, and horses are remarkably sensitive to human emotion. The beast was prancing nervously, rolling its eyes and snorting loudly. Many warhorses would bolt at the first sound of battle, dumping their riders and galloping away from the fight. Others would rear up or refuse to advance when faced with the wall of spears and screaming men that awaited them. The weight of William's armor, which had seemed manageable during training, now felt crushing. The metal pressed down on his shoulders and back with relentless force, and he could already feel the familiar ache beginning to spread through his muscles. The helmet restricted his vision so severely that he could only see directly in front of him through the narrow eye slits. His peripheral vision was completely eliminated, making him vulnerable to attacks from the sides or behind. As the army formed up for battle, William got his first real look at medieval military organization, and it was nothing like the neat, orderly formations shown in films. The reality was chaos barely held in check by shouted commands and violent threats from the commanders. Knights were scattered throughout the formation with no clear hierarchy or organization. Some were mounted. Others were on foot because their horses had gone lame or been killed in skirmishes. Many were already wounded from earlier fighting, sporting bandaged limbs and blood-stained armor. The common soldiers who made up the bulk of the army were in even worse condition. These were peasants who had been dragged from their farms and given crude weapons with minimal training. Most had never been in a real fight before, and their terror was palpable. They clutched their spears and shields with white knuckles, many of them openly weeping with fear. Some had already soiled themselves in anticipation of the coming violence. The enemy army was visible across the field, and they looked just as disorganized and terrified as William's own side. This wasn't going to be a clash between disciplined military units. It was going to be a collision between two mobs of frightened, desperate men who had been told to kill each other for reasons most of them didn't understand or care about. When the battle finally began, it started not with a glorious charge, but with a ragged advance that quickly deteriorated into chaos. William spurred his horse forward with the other knights, trying to maintain formation. But within seconds, the organized charge had dissolved into individual struggles for survival. Horses stumbled and fell, throwing their riders to the ground where they were trampled by the animals behind them. Knights collided with each other, their lances tangling and breaking, sending both riders crashing to the earth. The noise was unlike anything William had ever experienced. The clash of metal on metal was deafening, but it was overwhelmed by the screaming. Men screamed when they were wounded, screamed when they were dying, screamed in rage, screamed in terror. Horses screamed when they were injured, a sound that was somehow more horrible than human cries. The cacophony was so intense that commanders couldn't make themselves heard even when shouting at the top of their lungs. William's first glimpse of actual medieval combat shattered every romantic notion he had ever entertained about warfare. This wasn't skilled swordplay between honorable opponents. It was brutal, graceless, and utterly without dignity. Knights swung their weapons in wild, exhausting arcs, more likely to hit their own allies than the enemy. Most fighting was done with maces, warhammers, and axes rather than swords, because these weapons could crush armor and bones through sheer impact. The ground quickly became treacherous underfoot. Blood mixed with mud to create a slippery, sticky mess that made footing uncertain. Bodies of the dead and wounded created obstacles that had to be climbed over or around. Horses went down with broken legs, thrashing and screaming as they tried to rise, creating moving hazards that could crush anyone who came too close. William watched in horror as a knight near him took a mace blow to the helmet that caved in the entire left side of his head. The man didn't die immediately, but stumbled around blindly, blood pouring from his helmet, making horrible gurgling sounds before finally collapsing. Another knight had his arms severed at the elbow by an axe blow, the limbs spinning away in an arc of blood while the man stared at the stump in shock before falling from his horse. The effectiveness of armor in actual combat was revealed to be far less than advertised. Crossbow bolts punched through mail and even some plate armor as if it were cloth. Maces and war hammers transferred their full impact through the metal, breaking bones without even denting the armor's surface. And any weapon that found a gap in the armor's coverage could cause devastating wounds. William saw knights go down from relatively minor wounds that became fatal because they couldn't receive treatment while wearing their armor. A sword thrust through the armpit, a dagger between helmet and gorget, a crossbow bolt through a joint in the leg armor. These small openings became death sentences because the wounded knight couldn't staunch the bleeding while encased in metal. The myth of knightly invulnerability died quickly in the face of reality. Knights were being killed and wounded at a rate that seemed impossible to William's inexperienced. The armor that was supposed to make them masters of the battlefield instead made them slow, clumsy targets for more agile opponents. Peasants with billhooks were pulling knights from their horses and stabbing them through the gaps in their armor before they could regain their feet. The horses, despite their training, proved to be as much liability as asset. The animals were terrified by the noise and smell of battle, and many refused to charge into the forest of spears that awaited them. Others panicked and bolted, carrying their riders away from the fight whether they wanted to go or not. Wounded horses became uncontrollable, often attacking friend and foe alike in their pain and confusion. William's own horse was struck by a crossbow bolt in the shoulder and reared up in pain, nearly throwing him from the saddle. The animal's front hooves came down on a fallen soldier, crushing the man's skull with a sickening crunch. The horse then stumbled and went to its knees, sliding forward through the bloody mud and giving William his first terrifying glimpse of what it meant to be unhorsed in the middle of a battle. Struggling to his feet in his heavy armor, William found himself surrounded by legs, hooves, and swinging weapons. The world had become a nightmare forest of violence where death could come from any direction at any moment. A mace whistled past his head, missing him by inches. A fallen horse thrashed nearby, its hooves nearly connecting with his helmet. Everywhere he looked, men were dying in ways that defied description. The popular image of knights capturing enemies for ransom proved to be largely mythical in the chaos of actual battle. While ransom was indeed a motivation for some knights, it required being able to identify valuable prisoners and subdue them without killing them. In the heat of combat, with limited vision and communication, this was nearly impossible. Most fighting was to the death simply because there was no opportunity for the niceties of prisoner-taking. William watched as a wealthy knight attempted to surrender to a group of common soldiers, shouting his name and offering ransom. The peasants either couldn't hear him over the noise of battle or simply didn't care. They swarmed over him with their crude weapons, battering him to death with clubs and farming tools. His expensive armor, which should have made him a valuable prisoner, instead made him a target for their class hatred. The battle raged for hours. Though time became meaningless in the chaos, William lost all sense of strategy or purpose, focused entirely on the immediate goal of staying alive for the next few seconds. He swung his sword at anything that moved near him, not caring whether it was friend or enemy. The distinction had become meaningless in the press of bodies and the fog of war. By midday, the battle had devolved into a series of small, vicious melees scattered across the field. There was no clear front line, no organized units, just knots of men hacking at each other with desperate fury. The original objectives of the battle, whatever they had been, were forgotten. This was no longer about politics or territory or honor. It was about survival, pure and simple. William found himself fighting back to back with a knight he didn't recognize, both of them surrounded by enemy soldiers. The man next to him took a spear thrust through the gap between his helmet and gorget, the point emerging from the back of his neck in a spray of blood. He collapsed against William, nearly dragging him down as well. The weight of a dying man in full armor was enormous, and William had to struggle to push the body away while defending himself from multiple attackers. The smell of the battlefield was indescribable. Blood, sweat, urine, and feces created a stench that was overwhelming even through the limited breathing holes in William's helmet. Many men on both sides were vomiting from the combination of fear, exertion, and the horrible odors. The metallic taste of blood seemed to coat the inside of William's mouth, whether from his own split lips or from the spray of other men's wounds. As the afternoon wore on, exhaustion became as dangerous as enemy weapons. The weight of the armor, which had seemed manageable at the start of the battle, now felt crushing. William's movements became slower and clumsier with each passing hour. His arms felt like lead weights, and he could barely lift his sword above waist height. Many knights around him were dropping from heat exhaustion rather than enemy action. The medieval concept of honorable single combat proved to be completely absent from the reality of battle. William never once found himself facing a single opponent in anything resembling a fair fight. Combat was always multiple attackers against multiple defenders, with weapons coming from every direction at once. The idea of pausing to salute an opponent or exchange courteous words was laughably impossible in the chaos of the melee. Medical care on the battlefield was primitive and often more dangerous than the original wounds. Battlefield surgeons, when they could be found, worked without anesthesia or proper tools. Their treatment often amounted to amputating damaged limbs with crude saws or attempting to pull arrowheads out of wounds with bare hands. Many wounded men who might have survived their injuries died from the shock and blood loss of these brutal medical procedures. The psychological impact of the battle was devastating for William and the other survivors. The violence they had witnessed and participated in was beyond anything they had been prepared for. Men who had seemed brave and confident in the morning were reduced to gibbering wrecks by evening. Some knights simply sat in the mud, staring at nothing, their minds apparently broken by what they had seen and done. When the battle finally ended, it was not with a dramatic victory or defeat, but with a gradual realization that both sides were too exhausted to continue fighting. Men simply stopped swinging their weapons and began backing away from each other, creating gaps in the melee that gradually widened until the two armies separated. There was no clear winner, no glorious triumph, just two groups of traumatized survivors stumbling away from a field littered with the dead and dying. The aftermath was in many ways worse than the battle itself. The field was covered with hundreds of bodies, many of them still alive but horribly wounded. The screaming and moaning of the injured continued long into the night, creating a soundtrack of agony that would haunt the survivors' dreams for years to come. Scavengers, both human and animal, moved among the bodies, stripping anything of value from the dead and finishing off the wounded who had anything worth taking. William had survived his first battle, but the experience had changed him forever. The romantic notions of knighthood that had sustained him through years of brutal training were now dead, replaced by the certain knowledge that warfare was nothing more than organized butchery. He had learned that courage was not about bravery or honor, but about the ability to continue functioning while surrounded by unimaginable horror. And this was just one battle in what would likely be a lifetime of such experiences. After surviving his first battle, William returned to his lord's castle, believing he had proven himself as a knight. He was wrong. The brutal reality of medieval social hierarchy was about to crush what remained of his dignity and self-worth. In the feudal system, being a knight didn't make you powerful or respected. It made you a well-armed slave with pretensions of nobility. The feudal pyramid was a carefully constructed system of oppression that kept everyone except the king in a state of constant subservience. At the very top sat the monarch, who theoretically owned everything and everyone in the kingdom. Below him were the great nobles, dukes, earls, and counts, who controlled vast territories and commanded the loyalty of lesser lords. These men had real power, real wealth, and the ability to make life or death decisions for thousands of people. William, despite his knightly title, occupied a position near the bottom of this hierarchy. He was what medieval society called a knight bachelor, a landless warrior who served at the pleasure of his betters. He owned nothing, controlled no territory, and had no vassals of his own. His entire existence depended on the continued favor of Lord Edmund, a man who could strip him of his position, his equipment, and his livelihood with a single word. The relationship between William and his lord was not one of mutual respect between warriors, as romantic literature suggested. It was a master-slave relationship disguised with ceremonies and oaths. William had sworn to serve Lord Edmund faithfully, to fight his battles, to die for his interests if necessary. In return, Lord Edmund provided William with basic sustenance, a place to sleep, and the equipment necessary to function as a knight. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. Lord Edmund made this clear in countless ways, both large and small. William was expected to stand when his lord entered a room and remain standing until given permission to sit. He could not speak unless spoken to first. He could not eat until his lord had begun eating, and he could not finish eating until his lord was done. These weren't just courtly ceremonies. They were constant reminders of William's subordinate status. The economic reality of William's position was brutal. Despite being a knight, he had no independent source of income. Everything he owned belonged ultimately to Lord Edmund, who could reclaim it at any time. William's horse, his armor, his weapons, even the clothes on his back were technically the property of his lord. He was allowed to use these things only as long as he remained useful and obedient. This economic dependence created a psychological prison that was more effective than any physical chains. William could not afford to displease his lord, could not speak his mind, could not make decisions about his own life. He was trapped in a system that demanded absolute obedience, while providing no security or guarantee of fair treatment. A knight who lost his lord's favor found himself with no resources, no prospects, and no future. The daily humiliations were constant and degrading. William was required to perform personal services for Lord Edmund that had nothing to do with warfare or knightly duties. He served as a personal bodyguard, a messenger, a ceremonial ornament at court functions. He was expected to laugh at his lord's jokes, agree with his opinions, and show enthusiasm for his interests, regardless of his own feelings on these matters. When Lord Edmund wanted to impress visitors, he would parade his knights around like expensive possessions, showing off their armor and weapons as demonstrations of his wealth and power. William found himself standing motionless for hours, wearing his heaviest armor in uncomfortable positions, while his lord entertained guests. He was a living decoration, valuable only for the prestige his presence brought to his master. The social dynamics among knights themselves were vicious and competitive. Those with more experience, better connections, or greater favor with their lord created their own informal hierarchies within the knightly class. William, as a newcomer with no family connections or independent wealth, found himself at the bottom of even this subordinate group. The older knights took pleasure in reminding William of his low status. They would assign him the most dangerous duties, the most uncomfortable accommodations, the least desirable equipment. They would criticize his performance, question his courage, and generally make his life miserable whenever possible. This wasn't casual hazing. It was a systematic effort to maintain their own relative positions by keeping newcomers in their place. Competition for Lord Edmund's favor was fierce and often destructive. Knights would sabotage each other's equipment, spread malicious rumors, and sometimes even arrange accidents during training or combat. The reward for being the Lord's favorite might be better quarters, superior equipment, or assignment to less dangerous duties. The cost of falling from favor could be exile, poverty, or death. William learned that the noble ideals of knightly brotherhood were complete fiction. Knights were far more likely to betray each other than to provide mutual support. Trust was a luxury that could get you killed, and loyalty extended only as far as immediate self-interest. The bonds between knights were based on fear and mutual dependence, not friendship or respect. The treatment of knights who came from non-noble backgrounds was particularly harsh. The medieval world was obsessed with bloodlines and heredity, and those who had achieved knighthood through merit rather than birth were never allowed to forget their inferior origins. William's grandfather had been a minor landowner, which was barely enough to qualify for knightly training, but many of his fellow knights had more humble backgrounds. These new men were subjected to constant insults and discrimination. They were excluded from the informal networks that governed court life, denied access to the best equipment and positions, and treated as upstarts who needed to be put in their place. No matter how brave, skilled, or loyal they proved to be, they would never be accepted as equals by those who claimed noble blood. The economic pressures on knights were crushing and constant. Maintaining the equipment and lifestyle expected of a knight required far more resources than most could afford. William's armor alone cost more than a peasant family would earn in 5 years, and it required constant maintenance and occasional replacement. His warhorse needed expensive feed, regular veterinary care, and replacement when it was injured or killed in battle. The social expectations were equally expensive. Knights were expected to dress well, to give generous gifts to their lords and social superiors, to host elaborate feasts and entertainments. They were expected to own multiple horses, sets of armor, and weapons for different occasions. They were expected to travel with appropriate retinues of servants and followers. The cost of maintaining knightly status often drove men into desperate poverty. Many knights became heavily indebted trying to meet these expectations. They borrowed money at ruinous interest rates, mortgaged their equipment, and sometimes resorted to highway robbery or mercenary work to make ends meet. Some sold themselves into virtual slavery to wealthy lords in exchange for debt forgiveness. Others simply abandoned their knightly vows and disappeared into the general population, living as outlaws or common laborers. The legal system offered knights little protection from the arbitrary power of their superiors. While knights had some legal rights that were denied to peasants, these rights were largely theoretical when it came to conflicts with higher-ranking nobles. A lord could falsely accuse his knights of crimes, confiscate their property, or order their execution with little fear of legal consequences. William witnessed this firsthand when one of his fellow knights, Sir Geoffrey, questioned Lord Edmund's decision to raid a monastery. The raid was clearly motivated by greed, rather than any legitimate military objective, and Geoffrey pointed out that attacking church property might bring down the wrath of higher authorities. Lord Edmund's response was swift and brutal. He accused Geoffrey of cowardice and treason, confiscated his equipment, and had him beaten and expelled from the castle. Geoffrey's fate served as a warning to the other knights. Questioning their lord's judgment, no matter how reasonable the objection, was grounds for immediate punishment. They were expected to follow orders without question, even when those orders were illegal, immoral, or suicidal. The concept of honorable dissent or principled resistance was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. The Church, which theoretically supported ideals of justice and mercy, was completely complicit in maintaining this oppressive system. Priests regularly preached sermons explaining that social hierarchy was divinely ordained, that questioning one's betters was sinful, and that obedience to earthly lords was a form of service to God. The Church benefited enormously from the feudal system and had no interest in challenging its fundamental assumption. Religious ceremonies were used to reinforce social distinctions. When knights attended Mass, they were seated according to their rank and status, with the most favored closest to the altar and the least important relegated to the back of the church. Even in the presence of God, the social hierarchy was maintained and emphasized. Prayer became another opportunity for humiliation and reminder of one's place in the world. The psychological damage inflicted by this system was profound and lasting. William found himself constantly anxious about his standing with his lord, obsessively analyzing every interaction for signs of favor or displeasure. He developed the servile mentality that the system was designed to create, an automatic deference to authority that overrode his own judgment and self-respect. The constant stress of maintaining his position, while having no real security, took a severe toll on William's mental health. He suffered from what we would now recognize as anxiety and depression, though medieval medicine had no understanding of these conditions. Knights were expected to be strong and stoic at all times, so any display of emotional distress was seen as weakness that could result in loss of status or position. Sleep became elusive as William worried constantly about potential threats to his position. He replayed conversations and interactions endlessly, trying to determine whether he had said or done something that might displease his lord. He became hyper-vigilant, always watching for signs of danger or opportunity, never able to relax or simply enjoy a moment of peace. The social isolation was equally damaging. William could not form genuine friendships with his fellow knights because they were all potential rivals or threats. He could not confide in his lord because showing vulnerability or doubt could be fatal to his position. He could not seek comfort from family because his knightly duties kept him separated from them for months or years at a time. The few relationships William did form were based on mutual advantage rather than genuine affection. Knights would ally with each other temporarily when it served their interests, but these alliances were fragile and easily broken when circumstances changed. Trust was impossible in an environment where everyone was competing for the same limited resources and favors. The treatment of knights' families reflected their low status in the social hierarchy. William's wife, if he ever managed to marry, would be expected to serve the Lord's wife in much the same way that William served the Lord himself. His children would be raised in the Lord's household, where they would learn their place in the hierarchy from an early age. Family loyalty was subordinated to loyalty to the Lord in all circumstances. Knights who questioned this system or attempted to assert any independence were quickly reminded of their powerlessness. Lord Edmund kept detailed records of every knight's debts, obligations, and potential vulnerabilities. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply to keep his knights obedient without driving them to complete desperation. It was a finely tuned system of control that had been perfected over generations. The romantic literature of the time, which portrayed knights as free agents pursuing honor and adventure, was not just unrealistic, it was actively harmful propaganda. These stories created false expectations and unrealistic standards that made knights even more miserable when they compared their actual lives to the fictional ideals they were supposed to embody. William gradually learned to suppress his own desires, opinions, and personality in favor of the servile mask required by his position. He became skilled at reading his lord's moods, anticipating his needs, and providing the exact level of deference required in each situation. This wasn't adaptation. It was the slow death of his authentic self, replaced by a carefully constructed persona designed to ensure survival. The few privileges that came with knightly status were largely illusory. The right to bear arms was meaningless when those arms belonged to someone else. The right to own land was theoretical for landless knights like William. The right to dispense justice applied only to peasants and only within narrow limits defined by higher authorities. These privileges were carefully designed to make knights feel superior to the common people while keeping them subordinate to the real power holders. The system was so effective because it offered just enough hope to keep knights striving for advancement while making actual advancement nearly impossible for most. There was always the theoretical possibility of earning a small plot of land, gaining favor with a higher lord, or marrying into a more powerful family. These remote possibilities kept knights working desperately to improve their situations while never questioning the fundamental injustice of the system itself. By the end of his first year as a knight, William had learned the bitter truth about his position in medieval society. He was not a noble warrior defending justice and right. He was not a noble warrior defending justice and right. He was an expensive tool in the hands of men who viewed him as barely more human than the horses and weapons they also owned. His oath of loyalty was not a sacred bond between equals, but a contract of servitude that bound him to a life of degradation and exploitation. And there was no way out. The romantic image of knights living in magnificent castles surrounded by luxury could not have been further from the truth. William's daily existence was a grinding routine of discomfort, deprivation, and misery that would have broken the spirit of most modern people within weeks. The castle that was supposed to be his home was nothing more than a cold, damp, vermin-infested prison, where every basic human need became a struggle for survival. William's quarters in Lord Edmund's castle consisted of a narrow cell barely 6 feet wide and 8 feet long. He shared this cramped space with 3 other knights, their equipment, and whatever personal possessions they could fit into the tiny room. There was no privacy, no personal space, and certainly no comfort. The walls were rough stone that wept moisture constantly, creating an environment that was perpetually damp and cold. The single window in their chamber was nothing more than a narrow slit in the wall, designed for defense rather than light or ventilation. During winter months it was stuffed with rags and animal skins to keep out the worst of the cold, plunging the room into near total darkness. In summer, the lack of air circulation made the space suffocating and rank with the smell of unwashed bodies and rotting straw. Sleep was a luxury that William rarely enjoyed. The beds were nothing more than wooden frames strung with rope, topped with thin straw mattresses that had to be shared between 2 men. The straw was changed infrequently and became a breeding ground for fleas, lice, mites, and other parasites that made rest impossible. William would spend entire nights scratching at bites and welts, his skin raw and bleeding from the constant irritation. The bedding, when it existed at all, consisted of rough woolen blankets that were scratchy, smelly, and provided little warmth during the bitter winter months. These blankets were shared among all the occupants of the room and were rarely washed, becoming repositories for months or years of accumulated filth, sweat, and bodily fluids. The stench was overwhelming, but William had no choice but to wrap himself in these disgusting coverings or freeze to death. The castle's heating system was primitive and inadequate. A few fireplaces in the main halls provided some warmth, but the smoke had nowhere to go except into the rooms above. William's quarters filled with acrid smoke on a regular basis, forcing the occupants to choose between warmth and the ability to breathe. Most nights, they simply endured the cold rather than suffocate in the choking fumes. Water was a constant problem in the castle. There was no running water, no plumbing, and certainly no hot water for washing or bathing. Water had to be carried up from the well in heavy buckets, a task that was assigned to the lowest-ranking knights and squires. During winter, the well often froze, forcing them to melt snow or ice for their basic needs. The water that was available was often contaminated with sewage, animal waste, or simply stagnant and foul-tasting. Personal hygiene was nearly impossible under these conditions. William might go weeks without a proper wash, cleaning himself with cold water and rough soap when any was available. Most of the time, he simply scraped the worst of the dirt and grime from his body with a blunt knife or piece of rough cloth. Bathing was considered unhealthy and possibly sinful, so even when water was available, full-body washing was discouraged. The lack of proper sanitation created a nightmare of disease and infection. Open wounds, which were common among knights due to training accidents and combat injuries, became infected with alarming frequency. Without proper medical care or understanding of bacterial infection, these wounds often festered and turned gangrenous. William watched fellow knights lose fingers, hands, and sometimes entire limbs to infections that could have been easily treated with modern medical knowledge. Dental hygiene was non-existent, and the results were horrifying. Most knights had lost several teeth by their 20s, either from combat injuries or simple decay. Those teeth that remained were often black, broken, or rotting in their sockets. The pain from dental problems was constant and excruciating, but there was no treatment available except extraction with crude tools and no anesthesia. Many knights developed abscesses that could prove fatal if the infection spread to their bloodstream. The castle's sanitation system was primitive even by medieval standards. Human waste was collected in chamber pots that were emptied into open pits or simply thrown out of windows into the courtyard below. The smell of human excrement was omnipresent, mixing with the odors of rotting food, unwashed bodies, and animal waste, to create an atmosphere that was barely breathable. Toilet paper did not exist, so knights used whatever was available: leaves, moss, rags, or simply their hands. This led to frequent intestinal infections and diseases that could be debilitating or fatal. Dysentery was common and often deadly, causing severe dehydration and blood loss. William saw strong men reduced to skeletal invalids within weeks of contracting this disease. The food in the castle was barely edible and often dangerous to consume. The kitchen staff had no understanding of food safety or proper storage techniques. Meat was kept until it began to rot, then heavily spiced to mask the taste of decay. Bread was often moldy or infested with weevils. Vegetables were scarce and usually overcooked into a flavorless mush that provided little nutrition. Meals were served at irregular times and in insufficient quantities. Knights were expected to be grateful for whatever scraps they received and never to complain about the quality or quantity of their food. William often went to bed hungry, his stomach cramping from lack of proper nutrition. Malnutrition was common among knights, leading to weakness, illness, and slow healing of wounds. The water used for cooking was the same contaminated supply used for all other purposes. Food poisoning was a regular occurrence, with knights suffering from violent stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. These illnesses were often blamed on moral failings or divine punishment rather than poor sanitation, so no effort was made to improve food safety. Vermin were constant companions in the castle. Rats scurried through the walls and floors, contaminating food supplies and spreading disease. Mice nested in the straw bedding and clothing. Cockroaches and other insects infested every corner of the structure. These pests were not just nuisances. They were vectors for serious diseases, including plague, typhus, and other potentially fatal infections. The castle's cats, which were supposed to control the rodent population, were often too weak and malnourished to do their job effectively. Dogs roamed the halls, fighting over scraps and adding their own waste to already overwhelming sanitation problems. These animals were frequently diseased and could transmit infections to the human inhabitants through bites, scratches, or simple contact. The social dynamics within the castle created additional stress and misery for knights like William. The constant proximity to other people, with no possibility of privacy or solitude, created a pressure cooker environment where minor disagreements could explode into violent confrontations. Knights would fight over sleeping positions, food portions, or access to the limited washing facilities. The hierarchy within the castle was rigidly enforced through a system of petty privileges and punishments. Higher-ranking knights received better food, warmer sleeping positions, and first access to limited resources. Lower-ranking knights like William were forced to accept whatever was left over, no matter how inadequate or degraded it might be. Gambling was one of the few diversions available to knights during the long, boring hours when they were not training or fighting. However, this often led to additional problems as knights would bet possessions they could not afford to lose. Many knights found themselves without essential equipment because they had wagered it away in dice games or other contests of chance. Alcohol was freely available in the castle, and many knights turned to drink to escape the misery of their daily existence. However, medieval ale and wine were often contaminated or of poor quality, leading to additional health problems. Alcohol poisoning was common, and chronic drinking led to liver disease, brain damage, and early death for many knights. The lack of intellectual stimulation was crushing for men who had been educated and trained for leadership. There were few books in the castle, and most knights could not read well enough to benefit from them anyway. Entertainment consisted mainly of crude gambling, drinking contests, and violent competitions that often resulted in serious injuries. Religious observances provided some structure to daily life, but they were often more burden than comfort. Knights were required to attend multiple services each day, standing for hours in cold, drafty chapels while listening to sermons in Latin that most of them could not understand. These religious obligations took time away from more pressing needs like equipment maintenance or rest. The medieval calendar was punctuated by feast days and religious holidays that were supposed to provide relief from daily routine. However, these occasions often became opportunities for increased exploitation rather than genuine celebration. Knights were expected to perform elaborate ceremonies, participate in expensive festivities, and give gifts they could not afford. The castle's medical facilities were primitive and often more dangerous than helpful. The resident physician, if there was one, practiced medicine based on superstition, religious doctrine, and theories that had no basis in scientific reality. Treatments often involved bleeding patients to dangerous levels, administering toxic substances as medicines, or performing crude surgical procedures with unsterilized instruments. Mental health was not recognized as a legitimate concern in medieval society. Knights suffering from what we would now identify as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder were expected to simply endure their suffering in silence. Any display of emotional distress was seen as weakness that could result in loss of status or position. The isolation from family and normal social relationships took a severe psychological toll on knights. Many were separated from their wives and children for months or years at a time, maintaining only sporadic contact through unreliable messengers. The stress of this separation, combined with the uncertainty of their profession, destroyed many marriages and family relationships. Seasonal changes brought their own particular miseries. Winter meant months of bitter cold, limited food supplies, and increased risk of disease. The castle's inadequate heating system meant that knights would often wake to find ice formed on the inside of their chamber walls. Frostbite was common, and many knights lost fingers or toes to the cold. Summer brought different but equally serious problems. The castle's stone construction made it extremely hot during warm weather, while the lack of proper ventilation trapped stale air and increased the concentration of unpleasant odors. Disease-carrying insects were more active during summer months, spreading infections throughout the castle population. The constant dampness in the castle created ideal conditions for mold and fungal growth. Knights developed respiratory problems from breathing moldy air, and their clothing and equipment were constantly battling rot and decay. Leather goods deteriorated rapidly in the damp environment, requiring constant maintenance and frequent replacement. Personal possessions were few and carefully guarded. A knight might own a spare tunic, an extra pair of hose, perhaps a small eating knife, and a wooden bowl. These meager belongings represented significant investments for men with no independent income, and the loss or theft of even minor items could be devastating. The lack of proper storage meant that knights' few possessions were constantly at risk from theft, damage, or simple loss. There were no locks on doors, no secure containers, and no way to protect valuable items from the many hands that might covet them. Trust was impossible in an environment where everyone was desperate and competing for the same limited resources. Communication with the outside world was sporadic and unreliable. Letters were rare and expensive, requiring payment to messengers who might or might not deliver them safely. News from home could take weeks or months to arrive, and by the time it reached the castle, it was often outdated or irrelevant. This isolation added to the psychological burden of castle life. The routine of daily life was mind-numbing in its repetitiveness. Each day brought the same dreary sequence of tasks, obligations, and deprivations. There was no variation, no opportunity for personal growth or development, no hope for significant improvement in circumstances. Knights like William found themselves trapped in an endless cycle of survival and service with no prospect of escape. The cumulative effect of these daily miseries was the gradual erosion of hope, dignity, and humanity. Knights learned to expect nothing, to hope for nothing, and to endure everything with stoic resignation. They became psychological shells of their former selves, hollow men, going through the motions of life without any genuine engagement or enthusiasm. This was the reality of knightly existence. Not the glorious adventure depicted in romantic literature, but a grinding daily struggle against cold, hunger, disease, and despair. The castle that was supposed to be their fortress became their prison, and the life that was supposed to bring them honor became a slow death of the spirit. The romantic notion of knightly honor and chivalry crumbled completely when faced with the brutal reality of what knights were actually required to do. William's training had prepared him for combat against other warriors, but nothing could have prepared him for the systematic atrocities he would be ordered to commit against defenseless civilians. The code of chivalry was a beautiful lie designed to mask the ugly truth. Knights were professional terrorists whose primary function was to maintain social order through fear and violence. Lord Edmund's first order for William's real education in knightly duties came just 3 months after his initial battle experience. A village in the Lord's territory had fallen behind on their tax payments, and an example needed to be made. William was told to take a small group of knights and collect what was owed, using whatever methods were necessary. He had no idea that this routine collection mission would introduce him to horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The village of Millbrook was a collection of perhaps 20 hovels surrounding a small stone church. The inhabitants were peasants who scratched out a meager existence, farming the rocky soil and raising a few scrawny animals. They were already living at the edge of starvation, and the poor harvest of the previous year had left them with barely enough food to survive the winter. The additional tax burden imposed by Lord Edmund was literally impossible for them to pay. When William and his knights arrived at the village, they were met by the village elder, an old man named Thomas, who fell to his knees and begged for mercy. He explained that the villagers had already given everything they could spare, that their children were already dying of hunger, that they simply had nothing left to give. William found himself looking into the desperate eyes of a man who was pleading for the lives of his people. But William's orders were clear, and disobedience was not an option. Lord Edmund had specifically instructed that an example must be made, that other villages needed to see the consequences of failing to meet their obligations. The collection of taxes was secondary to the demonstration of power. William was there to inflict suffering, and the actual recovery of money was almost incidental to that primary purpose. The systematic torture began with the village elder himself. William's fellow knights seized the old man and bound his hands behind his back. They suspended him from a tree branch by his wrists, a position that dislocated his shoulders within minutes and caused excruciating pain. As Thomas screamed and begged, the knights demanded to know where the village's hidden wealth was stored. There was no hidden wealth, but the torture continued anyway. William watched in sick fascination as his companions applied techniques they had learned from years of similar operations. They lit small fires under the suspended man's feet, gradually increasing the heat until his flesh began to blister and burn. The smell of cooking human flesh mixed with the old man's screams created a sensory experience that William would never be able to forget. Even worse than the physical horror was the casual, workmanlike manner in which the knights went about their task. When Thomas finally lost consciousness from the pain, the knights moved on to other villagers. They selected a young woman who appeared to be pregnant and began questioning her about the location of grain stores. When she insisted that there were no hidden supplies, they stripped her naked in front of the entire village and began systematically beating her with wooden clubs. The psychological torture of public humiliation was as effective as physical pain in breaking down resistance. The pregnant woman's husband tried to intervene and was immediately set upon by 3 knights who beat him unconscious with their mailed fists. They then dragged him to the village well and repeatedly dunked his head underwater until he was on the verge of drowning, pulling him up just long enough to gasp for air before plunging him down again. This process continued until the man's struggles grew weak and his responses sluggish from oxygen deprivation. Children were not spared from the violence. The knights had learned that threatening children was often more effective than torturing adults, since parents would sacrifice anything to protect their offspring. They seized a boy who could not have been more than 8 years old and held a red-hot iron inches from his face, promising to blind him if the villagers did not reveal their hidden wealth. The child's mother collapsed in hysterics, begging the knights to take her instead. The sexual violence began when it became clear that the villagers truly had nothing more to give. The knights selected the youngest and most attractive women and girls from the village and dragged them into the church for systematic rape. The choice of the church was deliberate. It was both the most secure building in the village and a calculated insult to the villagers' faith. The screams echoing from the stone building created a soundtrack of horror that drove several villagers to attempt suicide rather than listen to their loved ones being violated. William found himself paralyzed by conflicting emotions. His training had taught him to follow orders without question, to show no mercy to enemies of his lord. But these weren't enemies, they were starving peasants who posed no threat to anyone. The violence being inflicted was far out of proportion to any possible offense they might have committed. Yet he was trapped by the expectations of his position and the presence of his fellow knights, who would report any sign of weakness or disobedience. The psychological techniques employed by the knights revealed a sophisticated understanding of human nature and the dynamics of terror. They deliberately selected victims who were important to the community, the elder, the mother, the children, knowing that the suffering of these individuals would have maximum impact on the group. They also ensured that as many villagers as possible witnessed each act of violence, understanding that the memory of these events would prevent future resistance. As the day progressed, the violence escalated beyond any rational purpose. What had begun as tax collection had become an orgy of sadistic cruelty. Knights began competing with each other to devise increasingly creative tortures. They forced family members to watch each other being brutalized. They made parents choose which of their children would be harmed. They turned the entire community into participants in their own destruction. The most psychologically damaging aspect of the operation was its complete arbitrariness. The villagers could have complied with every demand, given everything they owned, and the violence would have continued anyway. The knights were not trying to achieve any specific goal. They were simply exercising their power for the pleasure of causing suffering. This randomness made the terror more effective because it left no hope for escape through compliance or negotiation. William participated in the violence because he had no choice, but each act left permanent scars on his psyche. He held down struggling victims while others tortured them. He struck helpless prisoners with his fists and weapons. He stood guard while women and children were violated. With each passing hour, he felt himself becoming something monstrous, something that would have horrified the idealistic young man who had dreamed of knighthood. The operation concluded with the burning of several houses and the slaughter of the village's livestock. This final act of destruction served no practical purpose. It was pure vandalism designed to ensure that the survivors would face starvation in the coming months. The knights loaded their horses with whatever valuables they could find, including the villagers' seed grain that was meant for next year's planting. They were not just stealing the present, they were destroying the future. As William and his companions rode away from the smoking ruins of Millbrook, they left behind a community that had been utterly destroyed. Those villagers who survived would face a winter of starvation, followed by a spring with no crops to plant. The psychological trauma inflicted would be passed down through generations, creating a legacy of fear and hatred that would last long after the physical wounds had healed. The ride back to the castle was conducted in relative silence, but William could sense the satisfaction of his fellow knights. They had done their job well, and they knew that Lord Edmund would be pleased with the thoroughness of their work. The message had been sent to other villages in the territory. This is what happens to those who fail to meet their obligations. Compliance was not just expected, it was enforced through the most brutal methods imaginable. This pattern of violence was repeated throughout William's career as a knight. Villages that resisted taxation were burned. Merchants who failed to pay bribes were tortured. Peasants who showed insufficient deference were beaten or killed. The systematic application of terror was not an aberration. It was the fundamental tool of feudal governance. Knights were the instruments of this terror, and their effectiveness was measured by their willingness to inflict suffering without hesitation or remorse. The psychological impact of participating in these atrocities was devastating for William and many of his fellow knights. Modern medicine would recognize their symptoms as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but medieval society had no understanding of psychological trauma. Knights who showed signs of emotional distress were considered weak or cowardly, and seeking help was not an option. They were expected to endure their suffering in silence and continue performing their duties regardless of the cost to their mental health. Sleep became a battleground where William's memories would assault him with vivid recreations of the violence he had witnessed and participated in. He would wake screaming from nightmares, his body drenched in cold sweat, his heart racing with terror. The faces of his victims haunted him constantly, appearing in every shadow and every quiet moment. The sound of children crying would trigger panic attacks that left him gasping for breath and trembling with uncontrollable fear. Many knights turned to alcohol as their only available form of medication for psychological trauma. William began drinking heavily, using wine and ale to numb the constant anxiety and depression that plagued him. The alcohol provided temporary relief, but created new problems as his judgment became impaired and his ability to function deteriorated. Drinking became a desperate attempt to achieve a few hours of unconsciousness where the memories could not reach him. The hypervigilance that had been useful in combat became a disability in daily life. William found himself constantly scanning his environment for threats, jumping at unexpected sounds, and reacting with violence to perceived dangers that existed only in his traumatized mind. Simple interactions with other people became stressful ordeals as he struggled to distinguish between real and imagined threats. The moral injury inflicted by forced participation in atrocities was perhaps the most damaging aspect of William's psychological trauma. He had been raised with certain beliefs about right and wrong, about the protection of the innocent, and the importance of honor. The systematic violation of these values created a cognitive dissonance that shattered his sense of self and left him unable to trust his own judgment about moral questions. The isolation imposed by his traumatic experiences was profound and devastating. William could not speak about what he had done or witnessed, partly because of official secrecy requirements, and partly because the experiences were simply too horrible to put into words. He felt fundamentally different from normal people, convinced that anyone who knew the truth about his actions would be horrified and reject him. This isolation reinforced his trauma and prevented any possibility of healing through human connection. The violence also had a progressive, escalating quality that made each subsequent atrocity easier to commit. William found that his capacity for empathy and moral reasoning diminished with each act of brutality he participated in. Religious justification played a crucial role in helping knights rationalize their actions. The Church taught that the social order was divinely ordained, that resistance to legitimate authority was sinful, and that violence in service of that authority was morally justified. Priests would bless knights before they set out on punitive expeditions and offer absolution afterward, creating a religious framework that legitimized even the most horrific acts. The physical toll of constant violence was also severe. Knights accumulated injuries from their victims' desperate attempts at self-defense, scars from weapons that had found gaps in their armor, and permanent disabilities from the accumulated damage of their brutal profession. Many older knights walked with limps, were missing fingers or eyes, or suffered from chronic pain that made every movement agony. The knowledge that their own fate would likely mirror that of their predecessors created an additional layer of psychological torment for younger knights like William. They could see their own future written in the damaged bodies and broken minds of the men around them. There was no hope for a peaceful retirement, no possibility of redemption, no chance for a normal life after years of professional violence. The systematic brutalization of civilian populations also created long-term security problems for the knights themselves. The families and communities they terrorized harbored deep hatred and desire for revenge that could last for generations. Knights lived in constant fear of assassination, poisoning, or other forms of retaliation from their victims' relatives. This fear added another layer of stress to their already traumatized mind. The corruption of the knightly ideal was complete and irreversible. William had entered his training believing that he would become a protector of the innocent, a defender of justice, a champion of right. Instead, he had become a professional torturer, rapist, and murderer, whose very existence depended on the suffering of others. The transformation was so complete that he could barely remember the idealistic young man he had once been. This was the true face of medieval knighthood. Not the noble warriors of romantic legend, but damaged, traumatized men trapped in a system that demanded the systematic infliction of terror on defenseless populations. The psychological wounds they carried were as permanent and disabling as any physical injury, and there was no possibility of healing in a society that demanded their continued participation in atrocities. The violence they inflicted was not an unfortunate side effect of their duties. It was the central purpose of their existence, the tool by which feudal society maintained its oppressive structure. And the cost of wielding that tool was nothing less than their own humanity. By the time William reached his 40th year, he was already an old man by medieval standards. The brutal life of a knight had aged him far beyond his years, leaving him with a broken body, a shattered mind, and the growing realization that everything he had sacrificed his life for was about to become obsolete. The world was changing around him, and the knightly class was being swept away by forces they could neither understand nor control. The first signs of the coming revolution had appeared years earlier, but most knights had been too arrogant or too ignorant to recognize their significance. New weapons were appearing on battlefields that could punch through the finest armor as if it were cloth. Crossbows had become more powerful and accurate, capable of killing a knight from distances that made his sword and lance useless. But even more ominous were the strange new weapons that used explosive powder to hurl metal projectiles with devastating force. William first encountered these primitive firearms during a siege in Flanders, where rebellious townspeople had acquired several crude cannons from Italian merchants. The psychological impact of these weapons was immediate and profound. The thunderous noise they made was unlike anything from the natural world, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. Knights, war horses, already nervous animals were terrified by the explosions and often bolted uncontrollably at the first discharge. But it was the physical effectiveness of these weapons that truly horrified the knightly class. William watched in shocked disbelief as a single cannonball tore through 3 armored knights in succession, reducing them to bloody fragments in an instant. Armor that had taken months to craft and cost a fortune to purchase was rendered completely useless by weapons wielded by common craftsmen with minimal training. The social implications of this technological revolution were even more disturbing than the immediate military consequences. For centuries, the effectiveness of heavy cavalry had been the foundation of feudal society. The massive investment required to train, equip, and maintain a knight had made them the dominant force on medieval battlefields. And this military supremacy had translated directly into political and economic power. If any peasant with a simple firearm could kill a knight, then the entire justification for the feudal system collapsed. The church, which had been the knights' most reliable ally in maintaining their privileged position, began to distance itself from the warrior class. As their usefulness declined, bishops and abbots who had once blessed knightly expeditions and provided religious justification for their violence, now spoke of peace, mercy, and the spiritual superiority of prayer over warfare. The same institution that had created the crusading ideal now proclaimed that true Christians should seek salvation through contemplation rather than combat. Economic changes were equally devastating to the knightly way of life. The rise of professional armies funded by increasingly powerful monarchs meant that feudal levies of knights were becoming obsolete. Kings could now hire disciplined soldiers who fought for wages rather than feudal obligation. Men who could be trained specifically for new forms of warfare and equipped with the latest weapons technology. These professional soldiers were more reliable, more effective, and ultimately much cheaper than maintaining a class of hereditary warriors. The growth of commerce and banking created new sources of wealth and power that existed completely outside the feudal system. Merchant families accumulated fortunes that dwarfed the holdings of ancient noble houses, and they used this wealth to purchase political influence and social status. A successful cloth trader could now afford better armor and weapons than many knights, and his sons could receive educations that prepared them for roles in government, law, or the church that had once been reserved for the nobility. William witnessed the humiliation of his class firsthand when Lord Edmund was forced to borrow money from a consortium of local merchants to fund a military campaign. The man who had once commanded absolute obedience from his knights now found himself bowing and scraping before men whose grandfathers had been his serfs. The merchants imposed conditions on their loans that effectively gave them control over Lord Edmund's military decisions, reducing him to little more than a hired commander in his own territory. The psychological impact of this reversal was devastating for knights who had been raised to believe in their inherent superiority. William watched as men who had once carried themselves with arrogant confidence became bitter, paranoid, and increasingly desperate to maintain their fading relevance. Some knights turned to brigandage, using their military skills to rob merchants and pilgrims in a futile attempt to maintain their lifestyle through theft. Others became mercenaries, selling their services to the highest bidder regardless of the justice of their cause. The code of chivalry, which had never been more than a convenient fiction to disguise the brutal realities of knightly life, began to collapse entirely, as knights found themselves competing for scarce opportunities in a changing world. Former comrades became enemies as they fought over the few remaining positions that offered any hope of financial security. Loyalty, honor, and brotherhood were abandoned in favor of naked self-interest and survival. The training system that had produced generations of knights also began to break down as parents realized that subjecting their sons to decades of abuse and deprivation no longer guaranteed them a profitable career. Fewer families were willing to send their children to serve as pages and squires when the end result was likely to be poverty, unemployment, or death in some pointless conflict. The great schools of knighthood, which had once been filled with eager young recruits, found themselves with empty halls and aging instructors who had no one to teach. William's own lord began reducing the size of his household, dismissing knights who were too old or too injured to be useful in the new style of warfare. These men, who had devoted their entire lives to serving Lord Edmund, found themselves cast out with no resources, no skills applicable to civilian life, and no hope of finding new employment. Many became beggars or bandits, their fine armor traded for food or sold to collectors who valued them more as curiosities than as functional equipment. The rise of national armies, led by professional officers, marked the final decline of the feudal knight as a military force. These new armies were organized according to rational principles rather than traditional hierarchies, with promotion based on merit rather than birth. Common soldiers who demonstrated tactical ability could rise to positions of command that would have been unthinkable under the old system. The military profession was becoming democratized, and hereditary warriors were finding themselves obsolete. William experienced this transformation personally when he was assigned to serve under a captain who had risen from the ranks of common archers. The man was younger than William, had never owned a horse or worn armor, and came from a family of artisans rather than warriors. Yet his understanding of the new military technologies and tactics made him infinitely more valuable than knights with decades of traditional training. William found himself taking orders from a man he would once have considered beneath his notice, and the humiliation was almost unbearable. The technological advantages that had made knights dominant on medieval battlefields were rapidly becoming disadvantages in the new era of warfare. The heavy armor that had once provided protection now made knights slow and clumsy compared to lighter, more mobile troops. The massive war horses that had been essential for mounted charges were vulnerable targets for firearms and artillery. The individual combat skills that knights had spent years perfecting were useless in battles decided by disciplined formations of pikemen and gunners. The economic burden of maintaining knightly equipment became impossible to justify when that equipment was no longer effective in combat. A single cannon could cost less than a knight's armor but was far more useful on the battlefield. Professional soldiers could be equipped with effective weapons and armor for a fraction of the cost of maintaining a knight, and they could be trained to use these weapons in a matter of weeks rather than decades. The social structure that had supported the knightly class for centuries was crumbling from within, as well as from external pressures. The peasantry, who had once accepted their oppression as divinely ordained, were beginning to question the legitimacy of feudal authority. Peasant rebellions became more frequent and more successful as agricultural workers gained access to effective weapons and military knowledge. The aura of invincibility that had once surrounded knights was shattered, and with it went much of their ability to intimidate and control civilian populations. Religious changes also undermined the position of knights in medieval society. The Protestant Reformation challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, which had been instrumental in creating and maintaining the ideology of knighthood. New religious movements emphasized personal piety and direct relationship with God rather than the mediated salvation offered through participation in holy war. The crusading ideal, which had provided religious justification for knightly violence, was replaced by concepts of peaceful conversion and spiritual rather than military conquest. The Renaissance brought new ideas about education, governance, and human nature that were fundamentally incompatible with feudal values. Humanist philosophers argued for the dignity and potential of all human beings, not just those born into noble families. The revival of classical learning emphasized rational thought and empirical observation over traditional authority, and received wisdom. These intellectual changes created a climate in which the hereditary privileges of the knightly class appeared increasingly arbitrary and unjustifiable. William watched as the younger generation of nobles abandoned the military life entirely in favor of careers in law, administration, or commerce. These young men were receiving educations that prepared them for the modern world rather than clinging to obsolete martial traditions. They learned to read and write in vernacular languages, to understand mathematics and accounting, to navigate the complex political and economic relationships of emerging nation-states. The skills that had defined knighthood, writing, fighting, and following orders, were becoming as obsolete as the men who possessed them. The few knights who managed to adapt to the changing world often had to abandon everything that had once defined their identity. They became administrators, merchants, or scholars, using their education and social connections to build new careers in civilian occupations. But this transformation required them to reject the values and lifestyle that had shaped their entire existence, effectively killing their knightly selves to be reborn as something completely different. The psychological cost of this transformation was enormous for men who had been raised to believe that their worth was measured by their prowess in combat and their adherence to martial values. William struggled with profound questions about the meaning and value of his life as he watched everything he had believed in become irrelevant. The suffering he had endured, the atrocities he had committed, the friends he had lost, all of it seemed pointless when viewed from the perspective of a world that no longer needed or wanted knights. Many of William's contemporaries could not cope with this psychological crisis and chose to end their lives rather than face a future without purpose or dignity. Suicide became increasingly common among aging knights who saw no place for themselves in the emerging modern world. Others retreated into alcoholism, madness, or religious fanaticism, unable to accept the reality of their obsolescence. The few remaining knightly orders tried desperately to reinvent themselves for the new era, but their efforts were largely unsuccessful. Some became purely ceremonial organizations, maintaining the rituals and symbols of knighthood while abandoning any pretense of military function. Others attempted to transform themselves into trading companies or charitable institutions, but they lacked the skills and knowledge necessary to compete with organizations that had been designed for these purposes from the beginning. The romantic literature that had helped create the myth of knightly virtue became increasingly divorced from reality, as actual knights disappeared from the world. Writers began creating idealized versions of knighthood that bore no resemblance to the brutal, squalid existence that real knights had endured. These fictional knights became more popular and influential than their historical counterparts, creating a mythology that would persist long after the last real knight had died. William lived long enough to see his own life become a curiosity, a relic of a bygone age that younger generations could barely comprehend. Children would stare at his scarred hands and weathered armor with the same fascination they might show for exotic animals or ancient artifacts. The world he had known was gone, replaced by something that seemed alien and incomprehensible to a man whose entire identity had been shaped by obsolete values and extinct institutions. In his final years, William often reflected on the cruel irony of his situation. He had devoted his entire life to mastering skills that were no longer relevant, serving institutions that were no longer powerful and upholding values that were no longer respected. The suffering he had endured and inflicted had been for nothing, meaningful only within a system that was itself meaningless. He had been both victim and perpetrator in a historical tragedy that had lasted for centuries and claimed millions of lives. The death of the knightly class was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, grinding process of irrelevance and decay. Like an old tree slowly rotting from within, the institution of knighthood continued to exist in form long after its substance had disappeared. The shell remained, but the life had gone out of it, leaving only empty ceremonies and hollow pretensions. When William finally died, forgotten and alone in a small room above a tavern, his passing went unnoticed by a world that had moved beyond any need for his kind. His armor was sold to pay his debts.